Welcome to the Dead Sleep Double Fright feature, Story 1. Something is living in my house. It doesn't know I'm onto it. To give credit where it's due, he's very good at what he does. I'll be referring to the something in the title as a he for the remainder of this post for reasons that will become apparent later. It's a nice enough night, I suppose, though that may be a bit of a sidetrack thought. I'm writing all this down in my room, and above the clicking of keys and buzzing of cicadas outside, I can hear him rocking in his chair. One slow creak back, pause, followed by one slow creak forward. It's calm, but methodical. It's the same rhythm every single time without fail. The TV is on downstairs, but I doubt he cares what he's watching. No, it's all about keeping up appearances, hence why he works his rocking chair so deliberately. I haven't been home in a while, but had to take some time away from school to come back on family business. That's when I met him, or at least, that's when I knew for sure he existed. As far as I can tell, he's always lived here, in my father's house. When I was a child, I'd sometimes see my father going about his business in the house after he had supposedly gone out to run an errand. I'd be playing in my room or coloring, and from the corner of my eye, I would see him travel down the hall to his room or the bathroom or maybe the living room downstairs. When I would go to see, he'd be gone. Seeing this would always produce mixed emotions in my adolescent mind. It was a ghost. It had to be. But of my dad? It didn't make any sense. I used to lay awake at night trying to rationalize it. If it wasn't a ghost, it could be a clone, or maybe my dad's evil twin, or something. Maybe he didn't go out at all, and what I was seeing was just my regular old dad. Maybe the whole thing had been dreamed up by a child with a single parent and separation anxiety. At least, that's what I used to think. When I first arrived home the other day, he seemed happy to see me. At least, that's what I would ascertain from the fake smile plastered across the perfect replication of my father's face. He sat idly in his rocking chair, creaking back and forth as he watched me enter and slowly shut the door behind me. The silence hung thick in the air as we stared at each other, him with his eerily fake smile and me with my quickening pulse. Hey, Dad, I finally broke the silence. Did you have a good day at work? He nodded, not breaking eye contact. His smile seemed to shake ever so slightly until he lost composure and burst out laughing. Ha, you should have seen the look on your face, he wheezed in yet another spot-on rendition of my dad. Was that creepy or what? My heart still racing, I forced a smile. Yeah, Dad, you really got me. Well, come on, he said, gesturing in the couch next to him. Have a seat. Tell me about college, why don't you? Hesitantly, I made my way to the couch, taking note not to sit on the very end next to him. He turned his head to look at me, and I was able to keep him entertained with stories about school. Again, credit where it's due, my father had never been to college, so his fascination with my stories would be pretty accurate to the real thing. After what felt like hours of making faux pleasant small talk, I faked getting a text and diverted my attention. Sorry, Dad, I said. My roommate is calling about something. Can I go take this? He nodded, and I headed for the stairs, taking care not to tear into a sprint like I wanted to. When I reached the second floor landing, I practically scrambled to my room, locking the door behind me. After several minutes of silence downstairs, I heard him put on the TV and start his clockwork rocking. I couldn't sleep at all that night. At some point in the evening, he yelled upstairs that he was going to bed, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone crawling up the steps on all fours. he slunk into my dad's room, and the hall light went off not long after. This is how it's been, on and off, ever since I came home. I try to stay in my room as much as possible, but every once in a while, he'll invite me to come downstairs and talk to him. When I run out of things to say, or when I feel like I can't take any more before my heart explodes from fear, I excuse myself to do, quote, homework, and he puts the TV on and rocks back and forth in his rocking chair. I don't think he knows that I can hear him when he scuttles around on his stomach downstairs. That must be the one compromise to his otherwise accurate impersonation of my dad. Maybe it's how he goes everywhere, but I don't know. I'm certainly not about to ask my, quote, dad why he bear crawls and crab walks through the odd hours of the night. Then he'd know that I know. Hell, maybe he does know that I know. If he does, well, I can't tell who's working the longer con, me playing along with his game, or him letting me think that I'm playing along with his game. I've had to isolate the rest of my family for the sake of this little Cold War game that we play. Every once in a while, an aunt or uncle will call to ask if I need anything, and I'll politely tell them that I need my space. This is between me and him. I don't know how long it'll continue for, but this is how it has to be. I can't risk exposing this thing to unfamiliar people. Who knows how he'd react? On that note, I'm not sure my family would react any better to seeing him. You see, it's like I said at the beginning of this post. The thing pretending to be my father is very good at his impersonation. If I didn't know any better, I might have even overlooked his strange tics, brushing them off as my father growing eccentric in his old age. But for all the details this thing gets right, for all the painstaking efforts he makes to convince me that he is my father, he overlooked one crucial detail that still makes my blood cold to think about. I came back home for my father's funeral. Dead Sleep Double Fright Feature, Story 2. My favorite grandma lived outside, and I let her in. I can still remember the smell of pine needles and wild flowers that perfumed the air around her small little homestead. Like something out of Snow White, Grandma's quaint little log cabin, puffing up smoke signals from its old stone chimney, would appear enchanting. However, the impenetrable wall of woodland encircling it, it was eerily still and silent, with very little light peeping through the evergreen. Up until that point in my life, I had never stayed with my grandma. She had always come to visit us and stay in my parents' home, but due to my folks separating and on the verge of a messy divorce, I was sent to spend some time with her whilst they worked out whatever it was they had to work out. Upon stepping out of the car, my small Converse sank in the wet, muddy pathway and squelched their way up to the front door. The porch was covered in a funny-looking dream catchers and wind chimes made with crystals, adding little more magic to the place. But I still would have much preferred to have been at home, playing with my friends. All the negativity I had toward the place, though, quickly dispersed as she opened the door. I remember the smell of freshly brewed tea poured out from the kitchen behind her and wrap around me as she hugged me tight. Her embrace was warm, like hot cocoa on a snowy winter's day, and she was quick to assure me that everything was going to be fine, that she was going to look after me, and that we were going to have so much fun. My father, on the other hand, spared no words for me, and upon handing me over, sped off back to battling my mother over home ownership and custody. Grandma led me inside, and my eyes widened with wonder at the funny ornaments and oldie-worldy paintings of pixies by the lake not far from her homestead. Those were the days I spent with her, were my sanctuary from the constant raised voices and unpleasant screaming matches that I'd suffered for years. With Grandma, there was no rows or arguments. Instead, I spent my days playing with my figures, listening to fairy tales by a roaring log fire, and waking up freshly to cook pancakes. I got to play outside too, but under her watchful gaze as she sat on the porch, knitting and humming some funny tune from times long past. There were a few rules, but one of them was that I could not leave her sight when I was outside, and that I was never to go into the woods. She was always reminding me that there were dangerous animals in there, and that people had a habit of getting lost because of how densely packed it was there. Her concerns were justified, and that's what happened to my grandpa, you see. He suffered from dementia, and one day he wandered off and was never found. Despite that, my gran never seemed to show her sadness, always smiling, always happy. For a while, things were normal, peaceful, and mundane, until one night, when I was drifting between dreams, there came a noise, beckoning me awake. Tap, tap, tap. That's the noise that awoke me. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't my heavy-handed father hammering at the door, nor was it the calm drip of water droplets slipping from the faucet in the bathroom. The sound was gentle, yet direct, and it was coming from the window beside my bed. Turning over, I flicked the small lamp on and plucked my glasses from the bedside. I blinked once, twice, maybe 3 times to adjust my half-awake vision, only for my sight to be met by a surprise. Just an inch or 2 away from the glass, I saw her old, wrinkly face smiling from outside my window. It was my gran, peering in at me. Her face was whiter than usual, a sort of papery look to it, ashen, pale, and drowning in the silvery moonlight. Though most of her was shrouded in darkness, I could see her face clearly, smiling, her shriveled-lipped grin as she tapped upon the glass pane and pointed downward in an eager motion. She was trying to tell me to unlock the window, and though it seemed strange, she was my grandma. So, when she said that, I did what any small child would do. I reached over to the window, unhooked the window's latch, and went to move it. However, when I did, the window wouldn't budge. Still, she tapped on the window with her long, bony fingers. I hadn't noticed how unusually long they were before that, and they seemed to have many joints, each with digits ending in discolored cracked nails. I tried to open the window again, but it wouldn't budge. Looking closer, I noticed that there were nails hammered into the window, fixing it shut. I shook my head, and when I did, her smile shrank, and she herself stepped away from the glass and slowly disappeared into the veils of shadows outside. My need for sleep was too great, and despite the strange behavior of my grandmother, I just couldn't keep my eyes open, and before I knew it, I blinked and the night was gone. Like every other day, the golden rays of sun warmed my face, and the sweet syrup-soaked pancakes my gran had made called to me. Walking across the oaken floorboards, I could hear her humming her funny song and tunes whilst pouring herself a cup of tea. Weirdly, she was acting as if last night had never happened, and I was quick to notice that her fingers were different to last night. They were dainty and normal, covered in gem-studded rings. I was only half a pancake into my stacked breakfast feast when I asked her what she was doing outside last night and why she wanted me to let her in through my window. Tea sloshed over the cup edge, and for a second her controlled and gingerly pouring of the hot beverage was startled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her words shivering slightly. I told her that I tried to let her in last night, but couldn't, and that it wasn't my fault because the windows were nailed shut. Her whole demeanor changed the moment I spoke, and her joyful tone of the homestead came to abrupt halt. Turning to me, she asked if I was certain I had seen her last night, and that it wasn't just a dream. I nodded, and I told her I was definitely awake, not realizing that such an answer was not welcome. Looking back, I see now she wasn't just anxious. She was afraid, though as a young boy, I knew not of her fears or the truth behind such a question. My grandmother stammered her next words, and her face seemed to shrink and shrivel a little as she feverishly fumbled over every sentence that came from her mouth. "You must promise me you won't do anything if you see me outside at night. I sleepwalk, and sometimes I will do things that are strange, and if I ask you to let me in or to come outside, then ignore me. I will be fine if you just leave me outside, but if you let me in or talk even, I might wake up with a fright, and that can be bad for sleepwalkers, okay? So promise me you will just ignore me if I come by your window at night." She rattled off, her voice seeming to be almost unable to speak properly. So I did as I was told, for the most part. Every night I would see my gran tapping at each and every window in the house. She'd do silly things on the other side of the glass. She'd pull faces and make shadow puppets in the moonlight. Sometimes she liked to hide, skipping into the darker unlit tree line, hiding behind their trunks, before jumping up from beneath the window ledge, giving me such a fright. She'd silently chuckle and belly laugh at my reactions, but then she'd always return to gesturing for me to open the window or to unlock one of the doors. However, other than laughing at her silly behavior outside the window, I did as my gran told me, and I never tried to let her in. I began to get a strange feeling about my grandmother. At night she seemed so different, and I had noticed unsettling things about her body. For instance, one night when I looked outside, I saw her hunched over digging and scratching at the wood of the house just below the living room window, and in a silver of starlit radiance, I could see she was unclothed and her emaciated skeletal body just looked wrong. Her arms and legs were way too thin and long for starters, and there was something on her back. Actually, it was a pair of things that I couldn't make out because they buzzed and moved too quickly for my eyes to define them. When morning would come, I convinced myself that the strange features, the protruding spine, and the wing-like things buzzing on her back were nothing but the dark playing tricks on my mind or a strange dream brought on by my strange time spent at the homestead. Still, there was something off about her. She seemed quieter and had even stopped humming during the day. My gran became short-tempered with me, stopped telling me fairy tales, and was quick to shut down any questions I had. Yet at night, she'd appear happily dancing and performing outside, only to grow sad when I refused to let her in. I didn't want to wake her in the middle of her sleepwalking. She told me that would be bad and could even be dangerous for her health. And it seemed my grandmother was telling the truth about sleepwalking, because she always had her eyes shut whenever she was outside at night. And if that part was true, then I knew I had to listen to her about not trying to talk to her or let her in. On my last night I was there, though, I broke my promise. Earlier that day, I'd been playing outside with my G.I. Joes and had lost one of my favorite ones in the grassy clearing that the homestead sat upon. We looked everywhere for it, but to no avail. Then, when night came once more, there was a tapping at my window, and I looked to see her standing there, smiling. This smile was wider than before, almost ear to ear, though I couldn't see her ears. My grandmother walked around the house and I followed her until we got to the door, and she motioned to the 6 individual bolts, keeping it shut tight. I shook my head and she frowned and sulked her smile into an upside-down, upset expression before revealing in her hand the action figure I'd lost. Instantly, her expression became one of delight and she grinned. She offered it to me and gestured for me to open the door once again, but I shook my head and she instead placed the toy on the porch. Slowly, she stepped back into the shadows and disappeared entirely into the night, leaving my toy just slightly out of my reach. I remember staring through the kitchen window at my favorite toy, and somewhere inside me, my foolish desire for a chunk of plastic overruled my grandmother's words. Though I was small to reach the top bolts on the door, I retrieved a footstool and used that to give me some height. One bolt came undone quickly and quietly. The other slowly squeaked as its rusted metal shunted back. Then I loosened the lower bolts and took the key hanging on the wall and unlocked the kitchen door. Carefully, I peeled the door open, slowly, scoping the area and making sure not to be seen by my sleepwalking gran, out of fear of being told off for breaking the rules. Thankfully, she was nowhere to be seen, and I quickly yanked the toy from the wooden boards on the porch and rushed back inside. To be honest, however, any concern I had for that or being caught disappeared when I walked past my gran's room and saw through the partially open door that she was sleeping soundly. She must have gotten in through the back door and gone back to sleep, something which I was eager to do. Tiredness took a hold, and upon placing my head on the pillow, I did not awake to the humming of my grandmother, nor the scent of warm pancakes with syrup rose me from my slumber. Instead, I was rudely awakened, shook back into consciousness by my dad, who with a frantic look in his face asked me where my gran was. I told him everything that had been happening, the sleepwalking, the strange behavior at night, and he decided to call law enforcement. To the best of my ability, I recounted the previous night's events, explaining how my grandmother was outside and I saw her disappear into the woods. Despite officers assuring us that she would be found, an awful sense of dread filled my heart when my dad told them that the kitchen door was unlocked when he came in. This was all my fault, because in my urgency to avoid being told off or caught breaking my grandmother's rules, I'd forgotten to lock the door behind me. Without hesitation, I interrupted their conversation and exclaimed my guilt. I told them that I left the door unlocked, but that my grandmother was in bed when I walked back to my room. My dad looked confused and asked how she could have been in bed if I'd seen her outside only moments before that. The penny dropped finally, and even my naive young mind understood what had been happening. My grandmother didn't sleepwalk. There were two people who looked the same, one inside the house with me and one outside in the woods at night. I tried to tell them that I might have let someone in, that my grandmother had a twin outside, but who would believe such a thing, especially from such a confused little boy who was probably just dreaming or overcome with worry for his gran. They never did find her, another victim of undiagnosed dementia, just like my grandfather before her. My father's gone now, and I've inherited my grandmother's homestead through his will. I truly believed that as an adult, coming back here would help, that it would bring me some sort of closure to the whole thing and help make sense of it all. Yet I'm left with more questions now. For every night I am awoken, not by my grandmother knocking at the window. No, now when I look up and gaze through the thin glass pane, I see myself, pale-faced, smiling, and always gesturing to be let in.